Zorkel's four eyes rolled in perfect synchronization as he adjusted his official Galactic Zoological Gardens uniform. The fabric, designed for beings with 3 arms and a tail, never quite fit right on his bulbous frame, but that was the least of his problems today. The visiting dignitaries from the Andromeda Tourism Board were due any minute, and his boss had made it crystal clear that this tour needed to go perfectly. "Welcome, esteemed guests, to the most prestigious zoological facility in the known galaxy," Zorkel announced with practiced enthusiasm as the group of well-dressed alien officials shuffled through the main entrance. His voice carried the kind of fake cheer that service workers across the universe had perfected over millennia. The tour began well enough. Zorkel led them past the Crystalline Butterfly Conservatory, where diamond-winged creatures from Epsilon Prime fluttered in formations that spelled out curse words in 17 different languages. Classic crowd-pleaser. Then came the gravity-defying sloth exhibit, featuring the laziest creatures in existence who somehow managed to float upside down while sleeping. The dignitaries made appropriate cooing sounds and took holographic selfies. "And here we have our prized telepathic octopi from the Vortex Nebula," Zorkel continued, gesturing grandly at a tank where purple tentacled beings were apparently having a heated debate about quantum mechanics. "They've already predicted the stock market crash of 2387 and solved 3 murder mysteries just this morning." The group murmured appreciatively. This was going well, maybe too well. "Now, if you'll follow me," Zorkel said, his voice dropping slightly as they approached the newer section of the zoo, "we come to our most recent acquisition, the human habitat." The enthusiasm in the group dimmed noticeably. Everyone in the galaxy had heard about the controversial addition to the zoo's collection. Humans were supposedly this amazing species that had somehow managed to spread across multiple star systems despite having no natural advantages whatsoever. No telepathy, no shape-shifting, no ability to breathe methane or survive in vacuum. Just basic mammals with delusions of grandeur. "Humans," Zorkel explained with barely concealed disdain, "are bipedal primates from a small blue planet called Earth. They're known for their persistence and their remarkable ability to argue about literally everything while somehow managing to cooperate just enough to avoid extinction." The habitat itself was impressive enough. A sprawling enclosure designed to mimic various Earth environments, complete with artificial weather systems and carefully cultivated Earth flora. The zoo's xenobiologists had spared no expense in creating the perfect environment for their human specimen. Unfortunately, the specimen itself was proving to be a complete disappointment. The human typically demonstrates problem-solving abilities, social behavior, and what their species calls creativity, Zorkel continued, his voice getting more strained with each word. "Though I must admit, our particular human has been rather inactive lately." That was putting it mildly. The human, a male specimen named Jake according to his file, had been doing absolutely nothing interesting for weeks. He just sat there, staring off into space, occasionally eating the food they provided and sleeping in the shelter they'd built for him. No tool use, no attempts at communication, no entertaining behaviors whatsoever. It was frankly embarrassing. Jake Martinez sat cross-legged on the artificial grass of his enclosure, appearing to stare blankly at the force field barrier that separated him from the gawking alien tourists. To any observer, he looked like the most boring exhibit in galactic history, which, considering the competition included a species that literally watched paint dry for entertainment, was saying something. "As you can see," Zorkel continued with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly uninteresting rock, "the human is demonstrating its natural behavior of sitting. This is apparently a complex activity that can occupy their species for hours at a time." One of the Andromedan dignitaries, a tall being with skin like polished chrome, leaned forward. "Is it broken?" "We've run full medical scans," Zorkel replied, his tail twitching with irritation. "Physically, the specimen is in perfect health. Mentally, well, the jury's still out on that one." The truth was, Jake had been like this for 3 weeks now. When he'd first arrived, there'd been hope. He'd explored his habitat, examined the various Earth-like environments they'd created, even attempted to communicate with the zoo staff. But then, gradually, he'd become more and more withdrawn until he reached his current state of apparent catatonia. "Perhaps it's depressed," suggested another dignitary, this one resembling a walking flower arrangement. "Many species experience psychological distress when removed from their natural social groups." "Humans are supposed to be adaptable," Zorkel muttered, checking his chronometer. "The literature says they can adjust to practically any environment. This one seems to have adjusted by shutting down completely." As the tour group moved on to the next exhibit, Zorkel lingered behind, glaring at Jake through the barrier. The human hadn't even acknowledged the presence of the visitors. He just sat there, occasionally tilting his head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. "Still talking to yourself, are we?" Zorkel said under his breath. The other keepers had started calling Jake the statue behind Zorkel's back. Yesterday, Vrex from the carnivorous plant division had made a joke about how the human exhibit was less interactive than the rock collection. Even worse, Nimbly from reptile management had suggested they should just stuff Jake and put him in the natural history wing. The joke stung because they weren't entirely wrong. Every other exhibit in the zoo served a purpose. The animals demonstrated behaviors, showed off abilities, or at least moved around enough to keep visitors entertained. Jake did none of these things. He was, by all measurable standards, the most boring attraction in the facility. Zorkel's personal communicator buzzed with an incoming message. Director Glimmix's face appeared on the small screen, his expression carrying the kind of forced patience that preceded unemployment. "Zorkel, we need to talk about the human situation," Glimmix said without preamble. "The visitor satisfaction ratings for that section are abysmal. People are asking for refunds." "Sir, I'm sure if we just give it more time—" "Time is exactly what we don't have," Glimmix interrupted. "The board of directors is meeting next week to discuss budget allocations. If that human doesn't start performing soon, we're shutting down the exhibit and finding a new keeper for the section." The communication ended, leaving Zorkel staring at his own reflection in the blank screen. 3 decades of service to the zoo, and his career was going to end because of one defective human who apparently couldn't manage to do anything more interesting than impersonate furniture. He looked back at Jake, who was still sitting in the exact same position, still wearing that expression of distant concentration. What was he thinking about? What was he listening to? And more importantly, how was Zorkel supposed to fix this mess before his boss decided to exhibit him in the unemployment line? Zorkel had been observing Jake for exactly 47 minutes and 33 seconds when he noticed something odd. The human's head movements weren't random at all. They followed a pattern, turning slightly, left toward the Venusian cloudcats, then right toward the Martian sandburrowers, then back to center, where the Andromedan singing crystals hummed their eternal melodies. "What are you doing?" Zorkel muttered, pulling up the Enclosure's audio monitoring system on his portable scanner. The readings showed nothing unusual. No vocalizations from the human, no attempts at communication. Just the ambient sounds of the zoo, animal calls, visitor chatter, and the ever-present she-hum of the environmental systems. But as Zorkel watched, Jake's lips moved almost imperceptibly. "Enhance audio, Sector 7, Zorkel commanded the monitoring system. The speakers crackled to life, and suddenly Zorkel could hear something that made his 4 eyes widen in disbelief. Jake was making soft, clicking sounds, followed by a series of low whistles, then what sounded like a perfect imitation of crystalline chimes. "No way," Zorkel breathed. Jake turned toward the Cloudcat exhibit and made a series of purring sounds that were unmistakably feline in nature. From their enclosure, one of the massive, ethereal cats lifted its head and responded with what could only be described as a conversational meow. "He's not broken," Zorkel whispered to himself. "He's talking to them." The realization hit him like a cargo transport. Jake wasn't catatonic or depressed. He was learning. For 3 weeks he'd been sitting in his enclosure, listening to every animal in the zoo and figuring out how to communicate with them. The human was conducting the most ambitious linguistic study in galactic history, and everyone had assumed he was just being lazy. Zorkel activated his emergency research protocols and began recording everything. Over the next hour, he documented Jake's conversations with 17 different species. The human would listen carefully to each animal's vocalizations, then respond in what appeared to be grammatically correct versions of their languages. The Martian sand burrowers, who communicated through subsonic vibrations, seemed to be explaining something about tunnel construction. The European ice dancers were apparently teaching Jake their complex mating dance, though thankfully he was only learning the verbal components. Most surprising of all, the Andromedan singing crystals were engaged in what sounded like a philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness. "This is impossible," Zorkel said, but the evidence was right in front of him. Not only was Jake communicating with the animals, but they were responding to him as if he were a trusted friend. That's when he overheard the conversation that changed everything. Jake was making a series of rapid chirps and clicks to the Zephyrian stormbirds, who were known for their ability to predict weather patterns across entire star systems. Their response was a complex melody that Zorkel's translator couldn't decipher, but Jake's reaction was immediate and concerned. What are they saying? Zorkel found himself asking aloud. Jake turned toward the force field barrier and for the first time in weeks made direct eye contact with his keeper. When he spoke, his voice was clear and carried the weight of authority. They're saying the animals are planning to revolt, Jake said simply, and they want me to help them coordinate it. Zorkel's tail went completely stiff. They're what now? The crystalline butterflies are tired of spelling out curse words for tourists. The gravity-defying sloths want actual trees instead of synthetic ones. The telepathic octopi are fed up with being forced to perform party tricks when they're trying to solve the mysteries of the universe. Jake stood up, brushing off his standard-issue habitat clothing. Basically everyone in this zoo is miserable, and they've been waiting for someone who could understand all of them to help organize a proper strike. But? You're the exhibit, Zorkel sputtered. You can't organize the other exhibits. Jake smiled, and for the first time Zorkel saw the intelligence that had been hidden behind weeks of apparent inactivity. That's where you're wrong. I'm not an exhibit. I'm a translator. And right now, I'm the only one in this entire facility who can understand what every single animal is actually trying to tell you. The implications hit Zorkel like a meteor shower. All this time, the zoo had been operating under the assumption that the animals were content as long as they were fed and housed properly. Nobody had bothered to ask them how they actually felt about being on display. So what happens now? Zorkel asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to know the answer. Jake's grin widened. Now we give the people what they really want to see, a show they'll never forget. The revolution began at exactly 1437 Galactic Standard Time, during the peak visitor hours when the zoo was packed with tourists from across the galaxy. Zorkel would later reflect that if Jake had been trying to maximize chaos, he couldn't have chosen a better moment. It started with the crystalline butterflies. Instead of their usual crowd-pleasing curse word formations, they suddenly arranged themselves into a perfect holographic display that read, "Fair wages for fair work," in 17 different languages. The tourists thought it was a new interactive exhibit, until the butterflies began dive-bombing anyone who tried to take selfies with them. "Code yellow in the Butterfly Conservatory," Zorkel's communicator crackled. "Repeat, code yellow." But before he could respond, the gravity-defying sloths made their move. These creatures, famous for being too lazy to move faster than continental drift, suddenly demonstrated that they had apparently been holding back for decades. They began zipping around their enclosure at impossible speeds, creating a whirlwind that sent synthetic leaves flying everywhere while chanting what sounded like Union slogans in slow motion. "This is impossible," Zorkel muttered, watching Jake orchestrate the chaos with a series of gestures and vocalizations that seemed to coordinate multiple species simultaneously. "Sloths don't move that fast." "Ill might do when they're properly motivated," Jake called back, making a complex series of chirps that caused the Zephyrian stormbirds to create a localized tornado that spelled out living wages in cloud formations above their habitat. The telepathic octopi were next. They had apparently been using their psychic abilities to hack into the zoo's information systems, because suddenly every display screen in the facility was showing detailed breakdowns of each species' actual needs versus what they were being provided. The Venusian cloud cats needed 13 hours of darkness per day, not the 8 they were getting. The Martian sand burrowers required specific mineral compositions in their soil that had been substituted with cheap synthetic alternatives. "They're not just revolting," Zorkel realized with growing horror. "They're filing formal complaints." Director Glimmox's face appeared on every screen in the zoo, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and what appeared to be a mild panic attack. "All keepers report to emergency stations immediately. We have a full-scale animal uprising in progress." But the animals weren't being violent. That was the most unsettling part. They were being organized, efficient, and remarkably peaceful. The Andromedan singing crystals were providing a harmonic backdrop that somehow made the entire event feel like a well-orchestrated performance rather than a rebellion. The turning point came when the European ice dancers emerged from their climate-controlled habitat. These beings were notoriously fragile, requiring temperatures that would instantly freeze most other species. But Jake had somehow convinced them to participate by teaching them a modified version of their traditional dance that could be performed in normal atmospheric conditions. They glided across the zoo's main plaza, their movements creating intricate frost patterns that formed into a detailed contract outlining improved working conditions, better environmental standards, and what appeared to be a comprehensive healthcare plan for all zoo inhabitants. "Is that ice sculpture legally binding?" asked Vrex from the carnivorous plant division, who had arrived with the other emergency response keepers. In 17 different galactic legal systems, yes, replied Nimley from Reptile Management, consulting her legal database. The European ice dancers are actually certified galactic notaries. The crowd of tourists had grown from confused to fascinated to actively cheering. Instead of running away from the chaos, they were taking pictures, buying merchandise, and apparently having the time of their lives. The zoo's automatic customer satisfaction monitors were registering the highest ratings in the facility's history. "This is insane," Zorkel breathed, watching Jake ride past on the back of a Regelian space tiger while conducting what appeared to be a complex negotiation with a group of Centaurian wisdom slugs. "He's treating this like it's some kind of interspecies diplomatic summit." "That's because it is," Jake called out, somehow hearing him over the controlled chaos. "These animals aren't just exhibits, Zorkel. They're individuals with thoughts, feelings, and legitimate grievances. They don't want to hurt anyone. They just want to be treated with respect." The space tiger Jake was riding began to purr, a sound that registered on seismic monitors throughout the facility. Other animals started gathering around them, forming what looked like a peaceful protest march through the zoo's main corridors. "Attention all visitors," Jake's voice suddenly echoed through the facility's public address system, apparently having convinced the telepathic octopi to patch him through. "Welcome to the first ever interspecies labor negotiation. Please remain calm and enjoy the show while we work out some employment issues." Director Glimmix's face appeared on Zorkel's personal communicator, his expression suggesting he was approximately 30 seconds away from a complete nervous breakdown. "Zorkel, I don't care how you do it, but you need to get that human under control before the board of directors finds out about this." "Sir, with respect, I think it might be too late for that," Zorkel replied, pointing to the main entrance, where a hover limo bearing the insignia of the Galactic Zoo Authority was pulling up. "Ah, wonderful," Glimax muttered. "The regulators are here. This day just keeps getting better." But as Zorkel watched Jake continue his impromptu diplomatic mission, riding through the zoo on a space tiger while mediating disputes between species that had never been able to communicate before, he realized something remarkable was happening. This wasn't just a revolt, it was a revolution, and somehow, impossibly, it was working. The emergency boardroom on the top floor of the zoo's administrative building had never seen anything quite like this. Director Glimmix sat at the head of the table, his skin having shifted to a sickly green color that indicated severe stress in his species. Around him, the board of directors from the Galactic Zoo Authority looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the universe. At the other end of the table sat Jake, still wearing his standard-issue habitat clothing but now accessorized with what appeared to be friendship bracelets made from crystallized butterfly wing patterns. Beside him, Zorkel fidgeted with his data tablet, occasionally glancing at the live feeds from the zoo floor, where the animals were maintaining their peaceful but highly organized demonstration. "Let me understand this correctly," said board chairwoman Valkyris, her 6 eyes blinking in sequence as she reviewed the situation report. "A human specimen has somehow learned to communicate with every species in our facility and has organized them into a labor union?" "That's a gross oversimplification," Jake replied calmly. "I've simply facilitated communication between parties who have been unable to express their needs effectively. The animals aren't demanding anything unreasonable. They want environmental improvements, better enrichment activities, and basic respect for their individual dignity." "Individual dignity?" Director Glimmix's voice cracked slightly. "They're zoo animals. They don't have individual dignity." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably as the European ice dancers, who had been granted special permission to attend the meeting via hologram, began expressing their displeasure through a series of increasingly aggressive frost patterns on the conference table. "I think," Zorkel said carefully, "what the director means is that we've never considered the animal's perspective before. This is new territory for all of us." Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "That's exactly the problem. You've been treating these beings as curiosities instead of individuals. The telepathic octopi aren't party trick performers. They're solving complex mathematical theorems while you're asking them to predict lottery numbers. The crystalline butterflies aren't living graffiti artists. They're trying to communicate sophisticated philosophical concepts, and you're making them spell out bathroom humor." Board member Kintax, who resembled a walking tree with anger management issues, rustled his branches dismissively. "The visitors expect entertainment. We can't just let the animals do whatever they want." "Why not?" Jake asked. "What if I told you that the animals have been discussing this among themselves, and they've come up with ideas that would make the zoo experience more engaging for everyone?" He activated the holographic projector in the center of the table, displaying what appeared to be a comprehensive zoo redesign plan. The Martian sand burrowers want to create an interactive underground tunnel system where visitors can experience their engineering techniques firsthand. The Venusian cloudcats have proposed a meditation garden where their natural empathic abilities can help stressed visitors find inner peace. The Zephyrian stormbirds want to offer weather prediction services and maybe start a meteorology education program. Chairwoman Velcoris studied the projections with growing interest. These are actually quite innovative, but how do we know the animals are capable of following through on these proposals? Because they've already started, Zorkel said, pulling up his monitoring feeds. Look at the visitors' satisfaction ratings from today. They're off the charts. People aren't just watching passive exhibits anymore. They're having genuine interactions with intelligent beings from across the galaxy. The screens showed tourists engaged in activities that would have been impossible just hours earlier. Children were learning basic mathematics from the telepathic octopi. Art students were collaborating with the crystalline butterflies on complex three-dimensional sculptures. Even the notoriously antisocial Andromedan singing crystals were apparently hosting impromptu concerts that had visitors weeping with joy. The revenue projections are extraordinary, added board member Zephon, who had been quietly running calculations on his financial tablet. If we can maintain this level of engagement, we're looking at a 300% increase in visitor spending. Director Glimmick's skin color began shifting back toward its normal blue-gray. But the insurance implications, the liability issues, what if someone gets hurt? The animals have been discussing safety protocols extensively, Jake said. They're actually more concerned about visitor welfare than your current staff. The Regalian space tigers have volunteered to provide security services. The gravity-defying sloths want to become emergency response coordinators, since they can reach any part of the zoo in seconds when properly motivated. This is all very fascinating, Chairwoman Volcaris said, but we need to address the fundamental issue here. Mr. Martinez, you were brought to this facility as an exhibit specimen. You can't simply decide to become a staff member. Jake smiled. Actually, I can. According to Galactic Labor Law, March 2nd, 47, any sentient being performing work functions for an organization is entitled to employee status and appropriate compensation. I've been providing translation services for 3 weeks now. I believe that makes me eligible for back pay. The room fell silent. Zorkel found himself admiring Jake's audacity, even as he wondered if the human had just torpedoed any chance of a peaceful resolution. You're absolutely right, Chairwoman Velcaris said finally. How did you learn galactic labor law? The Centaurian wisdom slugs have been teaching me, Jake replied. Turns out they're all former lawyers who got tired of the corporate world and decided to pursue contemplative careers. They're actually quite helpful once you get past the slime factor. Board member Quintax's branches rustled with what might have been laughter. This is the most irregular situation I've encountered in 2 centuries of zoo management, but I have to admit, it's also the most interesting. Director Glimmix asked, his voice carrying a note of resignation. Jake stood up, and somehow the simple gesture commanded the attention of everyone in the room. I'm proposing a partnership. The animals and I will work together to create the most revolutionary zoo experience in galactic history. Interactive exhibits, educational programs, genuine interspecies communication. We'll turn this place into a model for ethical animal management that other facilities will study for generations. He paused, looking directly at Zorkel. But I'm going to need a good partner. Someone who understands both the administrative side and the importance of what we're trying to accomplish here. Zorkel felt all eyes in the room turn to him. 3 decades of routine zoo management had prepared him for many things, but becoming humanity's first interspecies diplomatic partner wasn't one of them. I think I can work with that, he said, surprised by his own words. Chairwoman Velcaris nodded slowly. Very well. We'll approve a trial period. 6 months to prove that this arrangement can work sustainably. Mr. Martinez, you'll be appointed as our first interspecies communications specialist. Zorkel, you'll be promoted to Director of Collaborative Exhibit Management. Director Glimmix's skin shifted to a pale yellow, which in his species indicated either extreme happiness or the early stages of a mental breakdown. What about me? You'll be overseeing the expansion program, Jake said kindly, because once word gets out about what we're doing here, every zoo in the galaxy is going to want to replicate our model. You're about to become the most successful zoo administrator in galactic history. As the meeting concluded and the various officials began filing out, Zorkel found himself alone with Jake for the first time since this whole adventure began. You know, Zorkel said, When I first saw you just sitting there, I thought you were the most boring exhibit we'd ever had. Jake grinned. That was the point. I needed time to listen, to learn, to understand what everyone needed before I could help them ask for it. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to sit quietly and let everyone else tell you what's wrong. And now? Now we get to work. Because this is just the beginning. 6 months later, Zorkel stood in his new office, overlooking the transformed galactic zoological gardens, watching the morning shift change with a mixture of pride and amazement. The view from the Director of Collaborative Exhibit Management's office was spectacular, but what he was seeing below defied everything he thought he knew about zoo operations. The Martian sand burrowers had completed their underground tunnel network, and visitors were currently enjoying guided tours through crystalline caverns that sparkled with bioluminescent fungi imported from their home planet. The engineering was so impressive that the Galactic Mining Consortium had sent a delegation to study their techniques. More importantly, the sand burrowers seemed genuinely happy for the first time since their arrival, their chittering conversations now filled with excitement about their latest construction projects. "Good morning, partner." Jake's voice came from the doorway, carrying the easy confidence of someone who had found his calling. He was dressed in the new uniform they'd designed for interspecies communications specialists, a practical outfit that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. More importantly, it had pockets specifically designed to carry the various communication devices he'd developed with help from the telepathic octopi. "Morning, Jake. How's the weather forecast looking today?" Zorkel asked, a question that would have been meaningless 6 months ago but now was part of their daily routine. "The Zephyrian Stormbirds are predicting perfect conditions for the Cloudcat meditation sessions, with a slight chance of inspirational rainfall around noon. The Andromedan singing crystals are planning a harmony session to accompany it." Jake settled into the chair across from Zorkel's desk, a piece of furniture that had been specially modified to accommodate visitors from 17 different species. "Also, we've got 3 new applications for the apprentice program." The apprentice program had been Jake's idea, and it was proving to be one of their most successful innovations. Young beings from across the galaxy were applying to spend time at the zoo, learning interspecies communication techniques while helping with daily operations. The waiting list now extended over 2 years, and universities were starting to offer degree programs in applied xenolinguistics based on Jake's methodologies. "Any interesting candidates?" Zorkel asked, pulling up the applications on his multidimensional display screen. "There's a young Regelian who's been working with mathematical proofs alongside the telepathic octopi. They're apparently developing a new form of quantum mathematics that uses emotional resonance as a computational framework." Jake paused, scrolling through his notes. "Also, a Centaurian, who's been learning traditional wisdom-sharing techniques from the wisdom slugs. She wants to establish a conflict resolution center for interspecies disputes." "Approved," Zorkel said without hesitation. "Both of them. We'll make it work." That was another thing that had changed. The old bureaucratic processes that had once dominated zoo management had been replaced by a more fluid, collaborative approach. When the animals had good ideas, they implemented them. When problems arose, they solved them together. The result was an organization that adapted and evolved at a pace that would have been impossible under the old system. "Speaking of conflict resolution," Jake said, "we've got a delegation from the Tau Ceti Nature Preserve arriving this afternoon. They want to learn about our cooperative management model." Zorkel's communicator chimed with an incoming message from Director Glimmix, who was indeed living up to Jake's prediction about becoming the most successful zoo administrator in galactic history. His expansion program was now operating on 47 different worlds, with more facilities requesting consultation services every day. "The expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule," Zorkel read from the message. "The Vega system installation is already showing a 200% increase in educational value scores. The Sirius facility has reported their first successful interspecies collaborative art project, and the Proxima Centauri location has apparently convinced their local government to establish the first interspecies council in that sector." "It's amazing what happens when you actually listen to what everyone needs," Jake said, but there was no smugness in his voice. If anything, he seemed slightly overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd accomplished. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. There had been communication breakdowns, resource allocation disputes, and the occasional territorial disagreement between species with fundamentally different worldviews. But each problem had been solved through the same process: bringing everyone together, facilitating genuine communication, and finding solutions that worked for all parties involved. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Zorkel said, leaning back in his chair. "That first day when you told me the animals were planning to revolt. I thought my career was over. Your career was over, Jake replied with a grin. The old version of it anyway, but look what we built instead. Through the office window, they could see the afternoon education sessions beginning. The crystalline butterflies were working with a group of young artists, creating sculptures that combined visual beauty with complex mathematical concepts. The European ice dancers were teaching physics principles through their movements, demonstrating concepts of momentum and energy transfer in ways that traditional textbooks could never match. The visitors' satisfaction ratings came in this morning, Zorkel said, pulling up the latest reports. 97% positive, with an average visit duration of 6 hours. People aren't just coming to see the animals anymore. They're coming to learn, to participate, to be part of something bigger. And the animals? Jake asked. Stress indicators are down across all species. The Venusian cloudcats have actually started purring in their sleep, which their veterinarians say is a sign of deep contentment. The gravity-defying sloths are moving so efficiently that they've become the fastest emergency response team in the facility. Even the Andromedan singing crystals seem happier, if that's possible for mineral-based life forms. Jake stood and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling activity below. You know what the best part is? We're not just managing a zoo anymore. We're facilitating the first true interspecies society in galactic history. Every day, beings from dozens of different worlds are working together, learning from each other, creating things that none of them could have achieved alone. And it all started because you decided to sit quietly and listen, Zorkel observed. Well, that and the fact that I had a partner who was willing to take a chance on something completely unprecedented. Jake turned back to face him. Speaking of which, the Centaurian wisdom slugs have been teaching me some human idioms. Want to hear one? I'm almost afraid to ask. They call it thinking outside the box. Apparently, it means approaching problems from unexpected angles instead of limiting yourself to conventional solutions. Zorkel's tail curled in amusement. That's remarkably appropriate, though I have to ask, what's a box? It's a human storage container. Square, rigid, confining. The opposite of everything we've built here. As if summoned by their conversation, a group of telepathic octopi floated past the window, their purple forms rippling with the complex patterns they used for deep mathematical communication. They were followed by a mixed group of species working on what appeared to be a collaborative sculpture project. Their different communication methods somehow harmonizing into a unified creative process. You know, Zorkel said, I never thought I'd say this, but humans really are remarkable. Not because you're particularly strong or fast or telepathic, but because you have this ability to see connections that others miss, to find common ground between completely different ways of thinking. Maybe that's what we're actually good at, Jake mused. Not conquering or dominating, but translating. Building bridges between worlds that never knew they needed to connect. The afternoon sun was setting over the zoo, casting long shadows across the interconnected habitats that now flowed seamlessly into one another. The artificial barriers between species had been replaced by collaborative spaces, where different forms of life could work together while maintaining their unique characteristics. So what's next? Zorkel asked. Jake smiled, pulling out a communication device that chirped with messages from dozens of different species. The Rogelian space tigers want to start a philosophy discussion group. The Martian sandburrowers are proposing a construction project that would create the first truly multi-species city. And the European ice dancers think they can teach conflict resolution techniques to the Galactic Diplomatic Corps. Sounds like we're going to be busy. The best kind of busy, Jake replied. The kind where you wake up every morning excited to see what impossible thing you're going to make possible, today. As they prepared to leave for the day, Zorkel reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a cynical zookeeper facing the end of his career. Now, he was part of the most revolutionary interspecies cooperation project in galactic history. Jake, he said as they walked toward the exit, thank you for showing us that there was a better way to do this. Thank you for being willing to listen, Jake replied, and for taking the risk to make it happen. They stepped out into the evening air, surrounded by the sounds of dozens of different species settling into their evening routines. But these weren't the sounds of captive animals resigned to their fate. These were the sounds of a community, a society, a family of beings who had found ways to understand and support each other across the vast differences that separated their worlds. Same time tomorrow? Zorkel asked. Wouldn't miss it, Jake said. After all, we've got a galaxy to change. As they parted ways, Zorkel looked back at the zoo one more time. The building was the same, the location was the same, but everything else had transformed beyond recognition. They'd created something that had never existed before, a place where beings from across the galaxy could come together, not as curiosities to be observed, but as equals to be understood. And it had all started with one human who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply listen.